Alright, so welcome back where we talk about all cars all the time. If you haven't been here before, please hit that subscribe button and give me a like on the video. I like to do videos about the history of car brands or specific cars themselves and their impact on the brand. And I'm preparing my next one, but I want to do something a little bit more fun, which was to look back on all the cars I've owned. Now, what you'll see here is a couple of things. Number one is I've owned some junk and some really boring cars. Number two is, my parents were never car people per se, right? When I was a teenager, we had a Oldsmobile station wagon and a Buick Regal. My dad had had an interesting car history. He had MGTCs and TDs, MGB, I think, a Fiat convertible. But again, by the time I was a teenager, he was driving a Buick. And I never developed a love of the muscle car per se. I don't sit around fantasizing about 911. So these cars, some of them I'm happy to be gone with, but some of them hold a special place in my heart. And every one of them, they represent a moment in time of where I was in my life. So this is an awesome trip down memory lane, and I hope you enjoy it. I'd love to see your comments below on what you think of my choices, and if you had the cars too and loved them, let me know. Alright, so number one is when I turned 15, 16, got my license, I got a 76 Buick Regal two-door hand-me-down from my dad. And I was all excited because at the time I wanted an MGB, and we started looking at the Ford dealer for a Mustang. Hey, I was super, super excited. Yeah, so my mom got the Mustang, and my dad took the station wagon, and I got a Buick Regal. It was just like the one here in this photo. It was kind of that faded urine yellow color. I actually ended up having it repainted. I wanted it to be black, but they wouldn't do it because the imperfections in the body. It was, nearly 10 years old at this time. And so I ended up with this really deep brown with gold flakes in it. I ended up absolutely loving it. At the time, you want something convertible and exciting, and this was really just a miserable car. But looking back on it, I loved this car. It was super comfortable, was not fast at all. And if you did go too fast, the front end got a little floaty on you. But it was unbelievably reliable. Horrible gas mileage, but unbelievably reliable. In the entire time we owned that vehicle, there were two problems with it. The air conditioning developed a leak we had to have fixed, and then a sensor went out that was affecting the fuel-air mixture. But it was a great vehicle, and I don't know what else to say. It was boring, but it was awesome. So when I turned 18 and I graduated from high school, I had my best friend who had a 74, I think, Jeep CJ5, and I wanted a Jeep so bad I couldn't stand it. So I went out and found a Jeep for $1,800. Never forget. It was a 66 CJ5. I don't have any pictures of any of these older any of these older vehicles. But it was a little bit like the one here in this picture. It had bigger tires on it, and the problem was it was horrifically unreliable. I knew nothing about cars until I bought this vehicle, and everything I know about cars I learned from this vehicle because the people who owned it before me had all tried to improve it and done it in a, let's say, half-hearted way. So it actually had a 307 from a Chevy under the hood. It had a Holly 4-barrel, an inline fuel filter, again, big wheels, custom carpet, but everything was done in a really half-hearted way. The gas tank had never been cleaned, so it had rust particles floating around which clogged the filters and the needle valves in the carburetor. I learned how to clean those out on the side of the road in the dark. I got so good at it. The transmission was from, I think, a 76 Jeep, original transfer case, but the transmission, they'd rebuilt it and forgotten a locking nut. So sometimes it would grind until I figured out that problem. I never figured out where the axles came from. They were not Jeep, I know that, but when I tried to get brake pads for it, Napa actually ended up just measuring the brake pads and ordering something that matched. Nobody was really sure where we came from. Might have been another Chevy product. We're not really sure. I had dual exhaust on it. Unfortunately, that ended right there at the door, so if you drove it even for a minute, you ended up smelling like exhaust for the rest of the day. When it ran, it was a beast, and I loved it. But I sold it almost exactly 1 year to the day after I got it, and afterwards I figured out it had been broken down 12 times for almost 2 weeks at a time. So basically half the time I owned it, it was broken and I was working on it. And there were so many more problems with it. For example, the engine and the original electrical system that came with the body was a mix of 12 volt and 6 volt. So randomly the car just wouldn't run. I finally figured out what points were and that they were being fed through a 12 volt system, not a 6 volt. So, or vice versa, whatever it was horrible. I finally got rid of it. And so what did I do is I went, well, I need something reliable, because by this point I knew I was going away to college. It was going to be about a 2.5 hour drive every weekend, one direction. I needed something reliable. So what did I do? I went back and got another Buick Regal. This time an '83 Buick. So this was the downsized Buicks. This had the 3800 series V6 in it. It had a light-duty transmission, automatic. That's important. And the fake Naugahyde leather roof. This was not a fast car. It did not accelerate fast. It didn't go fast, but it was comfortable. My gosh, it was one of the best riding cars on the interstate to this day I've ever sat in. I absolutely love the car, but it was less reliable than my first Buick. The window regulator went out while I was living in West Virginia, so I actually got to enjoy a West Virginia winter with my window partially down. The head gasket started leaking oil, and then about the time it needed its second replacement transmission, I decided it was time to get rid of the car. Now, I accept most of the blame for this. This did have, I figured out, a light-duty transmission in it, and because I was going back and forth to college, hauling all my stuff, and because I worked my way through college, hauling all of my stuff, all the trunk, all the back seat, all the front seat, through the mountains of West Virginia, I think I overheated the transmission and just wore them out. Shouldn't really have happened, but it did, and it ruined it for my, ruined my opinion of this vehicle. So just to give you some background, so in '86 I got the Buick Regal, the first one. In '89 I got the Jeep. In '90 I got the second Buick Regal. So somewhere around 1994 I had met people who had imports, and they raved about it. Now, growing up, I was very anti-import. I was sick and tired of hearing about imports, and I swore I would never own an import. But I'd met some people who had Volkswagens, and they raved about them, and I'll be honest with you, they sold me. Well, at the time, in '94, I was a senior in in college. I could not afford a Golf. I tried, but I could not afford one. But I found this thing called the Volkswagen Fox. This was a cool vehicle. Now, Volkswagen Fox, almost nobody's ever heard of it. It is Volkswagen's attempt to recapture some of that magic from the Beetle by moving down market and making a simple German car and offering it at a great price. In fact, one of their introductory videos actually showed a Beetle and a Fox running through a forest. You can see it here.
An idea whose time has come and gone, has come again. Introducing the Volkswagen Fox. At $56.90, it's German engineering everyone can afford. Again.
Now, the Fox was actually an Audi from the 70s that they gave to VW in Brazil to make, but then Volkswagen of the US decided to bring it up here. Never really sold well, was very well reviewed as a matter of fact, but I went out and found a Fox station wagon. So this is a two-door station wagon with a 4-speed manual, and I think it had like 81 horsepower or something like that. I fell in love with it. Dorkiest, nerdiest car I could possibly find. And I fell in love with it. So you can tell by this point, I was a senior in college. I'd already met the woman I was going to marry. I wasn't even really trying anymore. But it was a great vehicle. Interestingly, when I went to look at it the first time, decided I really needed to sleep on it and if I could afford it or not. And then I went back. The air conditioner had broke that week, so I got a heck of a deal on it, and for as long as I owned it, I never fixed it. This car introduced me to European engineering and how a car can handle, feel solid, also be light, cruise at high speeds. It was a great car, and if you were really light on the gas pedal, it got fantastic gas mileage. The only problem I ever really had with it was after I graduated, I got married, we went on our honeymoon, and the heat exchanger in the dashboard broke, dumped boiling hot water down on the floorboard, and I spent most of my honeymoon weekend in a Volkswagen dealership having that fixed. It cost me $700. I will never forget that because I didn't have a job at the time and I just graduated. I actually wrote a letter to VW and said, here's my situation. We were on our honeymoon and I had the $700 bill, and I sent them a copy of it. They actually reimbursed me for it because it had been a recall item. So I have a high opinion of Volkswagens and VW USA to this day because of how they handled that situation. It was a great car. I never should have gotten rid of it because it was fine, but I got my first job, I made some money, and I was looking for something more interesting. So what did I do is I went back to the worst car I ever had before. I ended up buying, I think, a 91 Jeep Wrangler. It was black and it was basic. 4-cylinder, 5-speed, no air conditioning, small tires. All it really had was 4-wheel drive. Kept this car for, I think, about 3 years, something like that. Actually moved to a different city, got a job with a company car, and it ended up parked most of the time. I drove it on the weekends. It actually got broken into at our apartment complex, and I eventually decided it was just time to get rid of it and get it off my insurance. But it was a great vehicle, super simple, and one of the most reliable vehicles I've ever owned because there was nothing to break on it. It was an engine and a transmission, and it just drove. Was not comfortable, it was loud, it was exhausting, got terrible gas mileage, and I loved it. Never should have gotten rid of it, but I did, and it was a great vehicle. You know, a lot of people, when they get to spring and they get spring fever, they think about buying their motorcycle or whatever. I'm a Jeep guy, and I'd like another one, but I am very dismayed at how expensive Jeeps have become. There is no low-to-the-ground, 4-cylinder, really simple one out there for people like me. I mean, the cheapest one is well over $20,000, and even used, they are too. So it's a little sad. It prevents me from getting another one. But hey, if I have a successful YouTube channel, maybe I'll pick one up and do a video on it. All right, so I just looked at the time. I realize I'm droning on here. I don't mean to, but I sold the Wrangler and had a company vehicle, but we decided we were going to move back to our hometown. We'd had our first child, and I needed a vehicle when I got here. So I went out and I looked for something cheap, basic, and reliable, and somehow I ended up with a Chevy Cavalier. I think this was a 99, something like that. It was this body style you see right here, 2-door. And I have such strong mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, it was perfectly reliable. It never broke. Nothing ever went wrong with it. The engine, transmission, drivetrain, electronics, everything was fine. At the time it was released, it compared very favorably to the Honda Civics and the Toyota Corollas. But it was cheap. It was cheap, cheap, cheap. The interior plastic was cheap. The design was non-existent. The engine, I'll never forget, the engine oil check was actually where you put in the oil tube, right? You know, like a lawnmower, okay? It was just so basic with a 3-speed automatic, but it started every day. It got me where it needed to go. The one fatal flaw of this car was that GM had introduced a inexpensive ABS system that they would use on all their cars. And I think it used a single channel at the back. The problem is this: it worked great. It was not refined at all. It was like dum 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 dum. But if you were going down a driveway and it was a little wet, right? Like it had been raining, the rear brakes would pulsate and you would just roll right into an intersection. It happened multiple times for me. You push the brake as far to the floor as you could, and it would just, and you just roll out into the road. I ended up getting rid of it partially for that reason, because it was a safety problem as far as I was concerned. Now, it stopped me on ice before, but it couldn't stop me at a wet intersection that was on a slope. So I could not stand the car, and I decided relatively quickly to get rid of it. So about probably a year and a half, 2 years later, something like that, I went and bought my very first brand new car. This is a 2001 Mazda Protege. I loved this car, and it was my first introduction to a Japanese car. It was silver, had a sunroof, a black interior. I actually got the base engine, but I got a 5-speed in it. Loved this car. It was absolutely phenomenal. The big mistake I made was that my wife did not and would not drive a 5-speed, so I could never switch off cars with her. So we kept this for a while. This is the one I really wish I still had. I love that vehicle this much. It was eye-opening and an introduction to Japanese cars, but I didn't keep it very long. And then also, I think in 2001, my dad passed away. And so when I went to sell his estate, I inherited a 98 Jeep Cherokee. So suddenly, we didn't need an extra vehicle, and so we ended up getting rid of the Protege pretty fastly. And I drove that Cherokee for a while. So this is, again, one of those, boy, I wish I still had it, because this is one of the best off-road vehicles in the world. It's a fantastic vehicle. Got horrible gas mileage. It did have a problem while we were on vacation. I had to get the fuel pump replaced. It actually was braking on the interstate, and we drifted into a Jeep dealer and had it fixed. It was really expensive. But the big thing is I was mostly driving back and forth to office, and it got horrific gas mileage, and it was time to get something more fuel efficient. So somewhere around 2004, I got a Honda Accord. So again, I was introduced to Japanese cars, and I got it. This Honda Accord absolutely was amazing. It was gold. I remember that. I remember the designers being interviewed and saying they wanted to look like a cheetah, and it was the smoothest, silkiest car I'd ever driven. And I'd driven BMWs and Mercedes, and I was really just blown away with the Honda Accord. And that was 2004, and around 2005, I got a 2001 Ford Focus. All right, picked it up used, cheap, inexpensive, great gas mileage. I want to say here, those cars there, it was, 99, 2001, 2001, 2004, 2005. It sounds like a lot's going on. It's not all me. Part of that also was my wife at the time, her changing cars, taking one of mine, me getting something different, kind of shuffling around. So it wasn't like I was, going through a car every 3 months. I don't want you to get that impression. But I got this Ford Focus and bought it used. It was the first year that the Ford Focus had been put out, and again, I loved it. Cheap dash, but it got great gas mileage. Problem was, it really started to have problems, and it was about 70 or 80,000 miles, something like that. The rear bearings went out, the engine control system started to mess up, and it ended up being unreliable to the point I was worried about it not getting me to work, and I couldn't have that. It was great on space, fun to drive. It was really awesome, but I think I got a version that was early production and beat up by its earlier owners, which may have been a rental car company. So that kind of explains it. So what I did is I decided I needed to go back and buy another Japanese car that I really wouldn't bother with. And I was going through divorce at the time, and I needed something that was small, something I could pay cash for, because I didn't have to make my wife happy. I wanted a manual transmission, and I needed to be able to put my mountain bike in the back of it. And I ended up, you'll love it, with a 2007 Nissan Versa hatchback, right? Laugh if you want. This car was not sexy to look at. It didn't get super gas mileage, but man, this thing had a lot of space inside, a huge back seat. You could lay it down, put a bike in the back of it, cruise all day long with your 6-speed manual. I loved this vehicle. And I want you to notice here, between 1986 and 2007, okay, I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 cars. Okay? In 2007, I bought my Versa. And for the next 10 years, over 10 years, I drove that car. Now, when I finally got rid of it, it was bumping right up against 100,000 miles, and it was starting to have some problems. I think it needed a clutch. I had some problems with the rear hatchback electronics. It was having problems, and I sat down and was like, it's going to cost more than the car's worth to fix. But that car I kept for 10 years, where before that I changed cars on average every 2 years. Loved my Versa. Broke my heart to get rid of it. But in 2018, I went out and bought my current car, which is a 2014 Honda Accord. And you can see why. It's reliable. Yeah, I got a great deal on it. It's comfortable. It gets fantastic gas mileage. I've had it for nearly, not quite 3 years now. And I'm as happy as I was the day I bought it, other than it needs a bath. So that's my car history up to this point. I'm sorry this ended up being so long, but again, this is really a trip down memory lane for me to go back and remember all these vehicles that I used to have. You know, how does this resonate with you? Did you have any of these vehicles? Do you think I'm a complete fool for buying some of them? Do you wish I'd kept some of them for today, like the Cherokee? Hey, let me know in the comments below. I appreciate you being here, and hope you have yourself a great day.